I'm going to present some lectures on the philosophical discourse on modernity. This discourse started around the turn from the 18th to the 19th century, and it has recently gained a particular significance. For this, a small but influential book, for instance, by Lyotard on postmodernity, is one among several indicators. There are, of course, many readings of the idea of postmodernity, however different. For instance, the interpretation of modernity and postmodernity, let's say, from the side of neoconservatism or from the side of post-structuralism may be. Both of them reject or at least relativize the basic conceptual horizon within which the self-understanding of European modernity has been formed, especially since the Enlightenment period. All theories of postmodernity, and this is the main connotation of this term, of course, pretend to have gone beyond this horizon, to have left it behind as the horizon of a past, at least of a passing epoch. I will dogmatically start with four propositions. First, the philosophical discourse on modernity presupposes the rise of a new consciousness of time and history, which cannot be traced back further than the last quarter of the 18th century, at least in terms of literary sources. Second, Hegel was the first to raise to the level of a philosophical problem the process of detaching modernity from the suggestions of ideals lying outside of itself in the canonical past of either Greek or Christian traditions. In this context, he uncovers subjectivity as the principle of modernity. Third, Hegel introduces into this discourse as the central topic what has since become known as the dialectic of enlightenment. That means the enlightenment process can only make good for its own deficits by radicalizing this very same enlightenment process. Now, this dialectic is attributed by Hegel, as you know, to reason with a capital R, with his concept of an absolute spirit, however, Hegel, in the end, betrays the very experience of modernity's own consciousness of time and history. Fourth, and finally, the young Hegelians, Feuerbach, Kierkegaard, Marx, and others, want to get their future-oriented present saved from the dictates of a reason which always know better. They would like to win back history as a dimension which, again, makes elbow room for a critique that in fact can respond to a deeply felt crisis of modernity which arises at the same time as this very term itself. With this type of radical historical thinking, the left Hegelians provoked reactions from two different sides, from the right Hegelians and later on from Nietzsche. Ever since Hegel died, and that means philosophically ever since metaphysics has been declared dead, these three parties dominate the philosophical discourse on modernity and also provide the main topics that have remained on our agenda until now. Let me give first some comments on each of these four introductory theses. After this, I can better concentrate on the particular position that Nietzsche holds in the context of this discourse, which was opened by Hegel and has been established then by the young Hegelians. First, to the new time consciousness. Whereas in the Christian West, the term New World, the term Neue Welt, had meant an age of the future, which was to dawn only on the last day, the secular concept of modernity as we use it expresses the conviction that the future has already begun. It is the epoch that lives for the future, that opens itself up to the novelty of the future. In this way, the caesura defined by the new beginning of the new world had been shifted into the past, precisely to the start of modernity. Only in the course of the 18th century did the epochal threshold around 1500, with the discovery of the New World, with the Reformation and so on, become conceptualized as this beginning. To test this, Reinhard Koselleck, a German historian, uses the question of when the term nostrum aevum, our own age, was renamed Nova Aetas, the new age. Koselleck shows how the historical consciousness that expresses itself in the concept of modern age or new age constitutes a perspective for the philosophy of history which arises roughly at the same time at the end of the 18th century, for the self-ascertainment of one's own standpoint from the horizon of history as a whole. Even the collective singular, Geschichte, history, which Hegel already uses in a way that is taken for granted, was a late coinage of the 18th century. The New Age lends a world historical quality to the entire past. Diagnosis of the New Age and analysis of past ages go, since that time, hand in hand. The new experience of an advancing and accelerating of historical events corresponds to this, as does the insight into the chronological simultaneity of historically non-contemporaneous developments. What emerges is the image of history as a process that generates problems. What emerges is a concept of time that becomes experienced as a scarce resource for the mastery of problems. It is experienced as the pressure of time, als Zeitdruck. The Zeitgeist, or spirit of age, one of the new words that inspired Hegel, characterizes the present as a transition which is consumed in the consciousness of a speeding up and in the expectation of the differentness of past and future. Now, Hegel was the first who, as a philosopher, was guided by this changed time consciousness. This is my second thesis. Only at the end of the 18th century did the problem of modernity's self-ascertainment come to a heat in such a way that Hegel could grasp this question as a philosophical problem, and indeed as the fundamental problem of his own philosophy. The anxiety caused by the fact that a modernity without models had to stabilize itself is conceived by Hegel as the source of the need for philosophy, als die Quelle für das Bedürfnis der Philosophie. Differenzschrift aus der Wiener Zeit. As modernity awakens to a consciousness of itself, a need for self-ascertainment arises, which Hegel understands as a need for philosophy. He sees philosophy confronted with the task of grasping its own time in thought, die eigene Zeit in Gedanken zu erfassen, die berühmte Formulierung. Hegel is convinced that he cannot even obtain an adequate concept of philosophy independently of a philosophical concept of modernity. Now, in this context, Hegel uncovers subjectivity as the principle of modernity. On the basis of this principle, he also explains the superiority of the modern world and its crisis character. This world experiences itself as a world of progress and of alienated spirit at once. Hence, this first attempt to conceptualize modernity is simultaneous with a critique of modernity. In modernity, religious life, to give only a very sketchy summary, religious life, state and society, as well as science, morality, and art, are transformed into just so many embodiments of this principle of subjectivity. Its structure has been grasped as such in philosophy, namely by Descartes and then, of course, by Kant, in form of the absolute self-consciousness. It is the structure of a self-relating, knowing subject, which bends back upon itself as object, in order to grasp itself as in a mirror image, literally in a speculative way. Kant carried out this approach of the philosophy of reflection in his three critiques, as you well know. He installed reason in the supreme seat of judgment, before which anything that made a claim to validity had to be justified. In the place of the rather substantialist notion of reason as developed in the metaphysical tradition, Kant puts the concept of reason that divides up into different moments, the unity of which now has only a formal or procedural character. He separates the faculty of practical reason and of aesthetic judgment from that of theoretical knowledge, and places each of them on its own foundation. In thus grounding the possibility of objective knowledge of nature, of moral insight, and of aesthetic evaluation, critical reason not only assures itself of its own, not only makes perspicuous the architectonic of reason, but it takes over the role of a supreme judge even in relation to culture. This is what makes Richard Rorty so nervous. By the end of the 18th century, science, morality, and art were also institutionally differentiated as cultural subsystems in which questions of truth, of justice, and of taste were autonomously elaborated, that is, each under its specific aspect of validity. And these spheres of knowing were separated off from the sphere of religious faith on the one hand, and from those of both legally organized and everyday life on the other hand. Here we recognize precisely those spheres that Hegel conceives as the embodiments of the same principle of subjectivity. And because transcendental reflection, in which this principle of subjectivity appears without any covering, so to speak, because this assumed a judicial competence in relation to those spheres, Hegel sees the essence of the modern world gathered into its focal point in Kantian philosophy. Since from this perspective, and with this I come to my third point, to the thought pattern of the dialectics of enlightenment, seen from this perspective, Kant does not perceive the differentiations within reason, the formal divisions within culture, and in general, the fissures among all those spheres as bifurcations and as dimensions. Hence, according to Hegel, Kant ignores the need for unification that emerges with the separations and divisions evoked by the principle of subjectivity. Such a need is forced on philosophy as soon as modernity conceives itself historically. In other words, as soon as it becomes conscious of the dissolution of an exemplary past and faces as an historical problem the necessity of creating all that is normative out of itself. So the question arises as to whether the principle of subjectivity with its structure of self-consciousness suffices as the source of normative orientations, whether it suffices not only as content for providing foundations for science, morality, and art in general, but for stabilizing a social and historical formation that has been set loose from all traditional bounds. The question now is whether criteria can be obtained from subjectivity and self-consciousness, which are taken from the modern world and are at the same time fit for a normative orientation within it. And this also means fit for a critique of modernity that is at variance with itself. To put it simply, the question is, how can an intrinsic ideal be constructed from the spirit of modernity that neither just imitates contingent features and variations of modern cultures, modern societies, nor is imposed upon them from the outside? If the question is posed in this way, subjectivity proves to be a one-sided principle. It does possess, to be sure, an unexampled power to bring about the formation of subjective freedom and reflection, and to undermine, above all, religion, which had operated as a unifying force in the past. But the principle of enlightenment seems not to be powerful enough either to regenerate or to substitute the devastated power of religion in the medium of reason. If philosophy should respond to the challenge of overcoming the dimensions of modern life, it has to start from a stronger presupposition than that from which the Enlightenment started. It has to start from the presupposition of what Schelling and Hegel called the absolute since their inner period. With this, philosophy can make sure of its goal from the outset, the goal of exhibiting reason as the power of unification. Reason indeed is supposed to overcome the state of direction into which the principle of subjectivity has plunged, both reason itself and the entire system of living conditions. Das ganze System von Lebensbedingungen, wie Hegel in a differential sagt. By criticizing the philosophical oppositions between nature and spirit, sensibility and understanding, understanding and reason, theoretical and practical reason, judgment and imagination, I and non-I, the finite and infinite, knowledge and faith, Hegel wants to respond to the crisis of the dimension of life itself. Otherwise, philosophical critique could not hold out the prospect of satisfying the need by which it is objectively called forth. So, the critique of Kant's subjective idealism is at the same time a critique of modernity. Only in this way can the latter secure its concept and thereby assure its own stability. The motives for a philosophy of unification, der Vereinigung und der Versöhnung, can be traced back to crisis experiences of the young Hegel. They stand behind the conviction that reason must be brought forward as the reconciling power against the alienated or merely positive elements of an age torn asunder. That mythopoetic version of a reconciliation of modernity which Hegel first shared with Hölderlin and Schelling, I will come back to that, still remains tied to models from the past, from early Christianity and from classical Greece. Only in the course of the Jena period, with his own concept of absolute knowledge, does Hegel secure a position which allows him to go beyond the products of enlightenment, that is, of romantic art, rational religion, Vernunftreligion, and bourgeois society without being caught by past models any longer. Now, the reverse side of this achievement was, however, that Hegel, with his concept of the absolute, regresses back behind the intuitions of his rebellious youth. I cannot, of course, follow Hegel in his paradoxical attempt to conceive the overcoming of subjectivity within the boundaries of a philosophy of the subject. I can only remind you of the final outcome of this breathtaking project. In the end, this project gave rise to a dilemma. Hegel has ultimately to deny to the self-understanding of modernity the very possibility of a critique of modernity. The critique of a subjectivity puffed up into an absolute power ironically turns into a reproach of the philosopher against the limitations of those subjects who have not yet understood either him or the course of history. This, at least, is the tenor of the end of his lectures on the philosophy of religion, and this is what you know from the famous foreword to the philosophy of right. Now, let me immediately turn to the fourth thesis, the proposition that Hegel inaugurated the discourse of modernity, that the young Hegelians, however, first established it. That is, they freed the critique of modernity from the burden of the Hegelian concept of reason. Hegel, with his emphatic concept of reality as a unity of essence and existence, had pushed aside just that element which had to matter most to the modern consciousness, and did matter to the young Hegel. The transitory aspect of the present moment in which the problems of an unrushing future are, so to say, tangled in knots. The old Hegel omitted precisely the actuality of the present moment, out of which the need for philosophy was first supposed to arise. He omitted this actuality of the present from his construction of the essential course of events. The present became the accidental, the transient, the insignificant, the fleeting, the stunted existence of a vast infinity. Against this concept of a rational reality, which is raised above the facticity, the contingency, and the actuality of passing events and oncoming developments, the young Hegelians, as you know, make a plea for the importance of existence or immediate reality. Feuerbach insists on the sensuous existence of internal and external nature. Sensitivity and passion testifies to the presence of one's own body and to the resistance of the material world. Kierkegaard stresses the historical existence of the individual. The authenticity of his existence is confirmed in the concreteness of an absolutely inward, irrevocable decision of infinite interest. Finally, Marx insists on the material existence of the economic foundations of our common life, the productive activity and cooperation of socialized individuals are the medium for the historical process of self-formation. Thus, Feuerbach, Kierkegaard, and Marx protest against Hegel's false, as it were, mediations carried out in the realm of mere thought. They insist on the desublimation of the spirit, which merely draws the real historical contradictions into the suction of an absolute self-reflection, so as to de-actualize them, to transpose them into the mode of the shadowy self-transparency of a remembered past, and to strip them of all seriousness. With this type of historical thinking, the young Hegelians revive that consciousness of time which once had inspired the reasoning of the young Hegel himself. Now, in order to show how Nietzsche enters in this scene, let me, still for introductory purposes in the second half of my lecture, briefly, or what is remaining from my time, briefly discuss the three most important topics on which the discourse of modernity focused ever since. First, the critique of subject-centered reason. Second, the exposed position of intellectuals. And third, the responsibility or the claimed responsibility for historical continuity or discontinuity, for revolution or counter-revolution. First, the parties that have contended about the correct self-understanding of modernity since the days of the young Hegelians, I will call them for short the left Hegelians, the right Hegelians, and the Nietzscheans. They all agree on one point, that a far-reaching process of self-illusion was connected with the learning processes conceptualized in the 18th century as Enlightenment. Agreement also exists about the fact that the authoritarian or repressive traits of a narrow-minded Enlightenment are embedded in the principle of self-consciousness or subjectivity. That is to say, the self-relating subject purchases self-consciousness only at the price of objectivating nature, internal as well as external nature. Because the subject has to relate itself constantly to objects in its knowing and acting, it renders itself at once opaque and dependent in the very acts that are supposed to secure self-knowledge and autonomy. This limitation is built into the very structure of the knowing subject that makes an object out of itself so that it never meets itself in its spontaneous, so to say, in its performing subjectivity. I mean, this is the point from which Fichte already starts. But this very limit, built into the process of self-objectification, remains unconscious in the process of becoming conscious. From this springs the tendency towards self-glorification and illusionment, that is, toward absolutizing the power of reflection at each given level of emancipation. So, in the discourse of modernity, the accusers raise an objection which has not substantially changed from Hegel and Marx down to Nietzsche and Heidegger, from Bataille and Lacan to Foucault and Derrida. The accusation is aimed at, against a reason grounded in the principle of sheer subjectivity. And it states that this reason only denounces and undermines all forms of suppression and exploitation, of degradation and alienation, only to set up in their place the unassailable domination of rationality itself. Because this regime of a subjectivity puffed up into a false absolute transforms the means of consciousness raising and emancipation into just so many embodiments and instruments of objectification and control, it fashions for itself an uncanny immunity in the form of a thoroughly concealed domination. The opacity of the iron cage of reason that has become positive is concealed in the glittering brightness of a seemingly transparent glass palace, to take a metaphor out of the time. all parties engaged in the discourse on modernity are united on this very point. Those glassy facades have to shatter. On the other hand, the three parties are quite distinguished, of course, by the strategies they elect for overcoming the positivism of reason. The left-Hegelian critique aimed at mobilizing the historically accumulating potential of a reason which only waits for the release against its mutilation, against the one-sided rationalization of the bourgeois world and its estranged culture. The right-Hegelians, on the other hand, followed Hegel in the conviction that the substance of state and religion would compensate for the restlessness of bourgeois society, as soon at least as the subjectivity of the revolutionary consciousness would yield to the stern philosophical insight into the rationality of the status quo. From this perspective, the fetishized rationality of mere Verstand, mere understanding only, was summoned up into the enthusiasm of socialist ideas. Therefore, the metacritical insight of the philosophers had now to be established against the subjectivity of those false critics. Finally, Nietzsche. He wanted to unmask the dramaturgy of the entire stage piece in which both the revolutionary hope of the left Hegelians and the reaction from the side of the right Hegelians enter on the scene. Nietzsche removed the dialectical form from the critique of a subject-centered reason, that is, he dealt with reason as a whole, the same way as the young Hegelians did with its sublimations. From his perspective, reason is nothing else than power, than the will to power that it, at the same time, delusively conceals. The same battle lines are formed with respect to the second issue, to the role of intellectuals who owe their privileged position to modernity's tie with reason. Like detectives on the traces of reason in history, the philosophers of modernity seek the blind spot where the unconscious nests in consciousness, where forgetting slips into memory, where regression is disguised as progress, and unlearning as a learning process. United in their goal of enlightening the Enlightenment about its narrow-mindedness, our three parties are indeed different in their evaluation of what intellectuals actually do and should do. The left Hegelians, or to take Marx's phrase, the critical critics, see themselves in the role of an avant-garde which ventures out into the unknown terrain of the future and which promotes the process of enlightenment, whether organized as political leadership and influencing the consciousness of the masses, or in the role of an aesthetic avant-garde which burns itself in the sensitivity of the creative moment, or in the shape of scattered and isolated individuals who leave behind their messages like letters in a bottle. Horkheimer and Adorno, for example, were thinking in just this way when they entrusted their dialectic of the Enlightenment to a small publisher at the end of the war. In contrast, The right-Hegelians, or the metacritics, see only in others, that is, in their counterparts, those intellectuals that are the very source of the danger of a perverted priestly class. From their point of view, intellectuals undermine the authorities of strong institutions and simple traditions. And so they disturb the business, these intellectuals disturb the business of compensation which this restless modernity has to settle with itself, which a rationalized society has to conclude with the securing forces of state and religion. By the way, the theory of the new class, which neoconservatives today proffer against the subversive advocates of a supposedly hostile culture, derives more from the setting and the inner logic of the discourse of modernity than from the facts of post-industrial society. Finally, those who place themselves in the tradition of the critique of reason practiced by Nietzsche, they criticize the betrayal of the intellectuals no less vehemently than is the crimes that intellectual avant-gardes have committed in the name of universal human reason. But they do not make easy exceptions of themselves. This would become clear if one would, in a bit more detail, compare, for instance, Foucault's critique of the general intellectual with Arnold Pearl's critique of intellectuals in general. A third issue makes the discourse on modernity, third issue marks the discourse on modernity because history is experienced as a crisis-ridden process, because the present is experienced as a flaring up of critical ramifications, and the future as the pressure of time, as a challenge of unsolved problems. There arises a sharp consciousness of the danger of missed decisions and of neglected interventions. There arises a perspective from which intellectuals are called to account for the present state of affairs as the past of the future present. There arises the suggestion of a responsibility for the connection of one situation to the next, a responsibility for the continuation of a process that has lost its nature-like spontaneity and refuses to hold out the promise of any taken for granted continuity. It is not only the left Hegelians, those philosophers of the deep, which, for whom Moses Hess claimed the title of the party of the movement. It was not only they who were gripped by this nervous tension, it also gripped in quite a different way the right Hegelians, the party of continuity, as they had been called by contemporaries already. It also gripped that party that pressed for sobriety, the party of those who, in the face of a more and more automatic modernization, shifted the burden of proof for any planned intervention to the revolutionaries, to the movers, to the reformers, to the changers. Of course, even within one and the same party, the attitudes toward continuity varied. In the Marxist tradition, for instance, the spectrum ranged from this side to Karl Koch, Walter Benjamin, to the ultra-leftists who could only imagine the revolution as a leap out of the recurring barbarism of prehistory as an explosion of the continuity of all history. This attitude, inspired by the surrealist consciousness of time, has something in common with the anarchism of those who, following Nietzsche, oppose to the universal nexus of power and delusion by appeal to local resistance, to the painful reflex of the tortured body, and to the spontaneous revolts of repressed internal nature. Now, let me briefly summarize these three topics of the discourse on modernity and my thesis in general. The young Hegelians took over from Hegel the theme and the self-reassurance of modernity. They set the rules for the critique of a subject-centered reason, for the dispute about the privileged position of the intellectuals, and about the responsibility for the correct measure of historical continuity and discontinuity. With their partisanship of philosophies becoming practical, the left Hegelians provoked two opponents who accepted the issues and the rules of the game. These opponents did not, and this I think is important to stress, these opponents did not step outside the discourse in order to make way for the authority of models from the past. This old conservative recourse to religious or metaphysical authority no longer counted in this discourse. Everything that was, so to say, old European was devalued. To the party of movement, there responded first a party of continuity who in fact wanted to preserve only the inevitable changes of capitalist modernization. That is to say, within the discourse on modernity, the tendency to preserve, the very conservative tendency to preserve, was transformed into what we today would call neoconservative assent to a mobilization of society that seemed to be occurring anyway. With Nietzsche and the neo-romantics, a third party entered the competition. This partner wanted to pull the rug out from under the radicals and the conservatives alike. This party struck the subjective genitive, the genitivo subjective, from the phrase critique of reason. By taking critique out of the hands of a reason onto which the other two parties still wanted to rely with how many reservations ever. Well, it might occur to us now to distance ourselves from this whole discourse on modernity, to opt out of this discourse as a whole and to leave a scene behind us which, after all, was set in the early 19th century. There is no lack of such attempts to outdo the familiar game of mutually outdoing. They are easily recognizable by a prefix, by the neologisms formed with postmodernity, post-histoire, and so on. As far as I am regarded, I hesitate to believe that we can break the rules of the game, that we can overcome the discourse on modernity, be it by means of deconstruction or under the gaze of a fictive ethnology of the present. This overcoming is what Nietzsche and his followers pretend to achieve. And on their project, I would like, therefore, to focus in the following lectures. My rather sketchy introduction should have brought us by now into a position from which we can take the perspective of Nietzsche and his followers on what they think the discourse on modernity is about. I think for the first time I should accurately finish after 50 minutes. I can't promise you that I won't use at least 60 minutes the next times. You will have realized in the meantime that I postpone the topic announced for today for tomorrow's lecture. In fact, a deferral without any deeper meaning. Thank you very much. I must say I like to discuss in this country. There are wonderful experiences which I don't have in any other. So please feel we can do it very closely.
Yes, sir.
To what extent do you think your reconstruction is historically accurate, and to what extent do you think it's really oriented towards certain contemporary debates that you, in a sense, are negotiating through a kind of historical reflection?
I mean, this is a difficult question. Of course, what I intend is somehow to do both, to be, in a way, historically providing a guideline for an interpretation which could be, in detail, in more detail, made one of several accurate readings of what happened at that break between Hegel and the young Hegelians. And at the same time, of course, I do think that with my provocative proposition that we are still contemporaries of the young Hegelians, I immediately refer to present discussions which start from the very opposite assumption that, of course, we are in a position, so to say, after the closure of, let's say, metaphysics, to put it in Heideggerian terms, which has come about only, at least not before, the writings of Nietzsche. So I intend somehow to do both, but apparently to gather some loose threads, as I did, just for introductory purposes, namely to provide, so to say, an historical background for what I am going to do. Such an attempt cannot stand any immediate historical check. I mean, then I have to write out these lectures, and upon that one might try to check whether this is rather accurate to an extent that readings of that sort can be accurate at all.
How would you distinguish what you're doing from what Foucault calls genealogy? I mean, do you see there a convergence between what you're doing and what Foucault is trying to do?
No, I mean, I would be happy to engage in such obviously disclosing studies as Foucault did. But I will focus on Foucault later on, and then it will become apparent. No, I mean, what I am doing is rather traditional and conventional. I am not standing here with the claim that I am after this or that. But I am just claiming that I am continuing a discourse on modernity which started with Hegel and the young Hegelians. It might be a rather modest claim, and so I feel happy.
Yes, sir.
How would you describe the continuities of these lectures? Maybe it's anticipating too much, but how would you see the continuity of these lectures, either autobiographically or analytically, with your broader work on the theory of action, the theory of communicative action?
Yeah, I'm aware that there must be several colleagues and students who expected me to behave a bit more sociologically. But for this present purpose, I have to warn you, it won't change in climate. I will just continue, in terms of adding some readings to a certain discourse on the contemporaneous history of philosophy. Now, the relation to my recent book on communicative action is that, here I try to do something complementary. While I dare to develop a concept of communicative rationality in that book, and in a certain non-philosophical, basically non-philosophical context. What I am doing here is to go through some of the radical, through the lines of a radical critique of reason, which would imply a rejection of such an attempt which I have undertaken. So the complementary thing is to take, in fact, this criticism as serious as I can in order to see then what I have to learn, firstly, and secondly, whether I have to modify or to redefine what I have done so far. What I really intend to do, I haven't written my last lecture of this, not the one which I'm going to give, but the last lecture of this whole enterprise. What I really intend to do is to explain why, if you seriously adopt that very decentered notion of communicative rationality, why you then can avoid, I do think, most of the serious objections which can be, of course, raised against a more narrow concept of reason, which is the common focus of all these three strands. from the left Hegelians, it goes up to present approaches of praxis philosophy, including even the American neo-pragmatist attempts of a praxis philosophy of the type of my friend Dick Bernstein or of Chuck Taylor. The right Hegelian criticism of modernity is, of course, leading through Max Weber up to those former liberal social theorists which now stage as neoconservatives, while, I mean, the Nietzschean tradition, and this is the reason why I only use the other things as a background, while the Nietzschean discussions provide not only the most serious challenge to my own thinking, but are also, in another way, the most original and most interesting contributions to ongoing discussions.
Yes, please.
Professor Habermas, how do you situate the critique of modernity, critiques that are associated with people like Karl Löwit and Hannah Arendt and Leo Strauss in the tripartite analysis that you've given us today?
Yes. Yes, that's, you see, if you start with the typology, I am a sociologist, and so I'm used to commit all the crimes which we are forbidden to commit as philosophers, at least to put schedules with sheer chalk on the blackboard and so on, all this. So I also start with such a typology. I mean, everybody of us knows what it means to dare to just start with a typology. That means it should somehow cover certain readings, but it excludes from the very beginning many other things. So, the neo-Aristotelians to whom you are referring are not just of one kind, as far as I can distinguish them. I like to think of Hannah Arendt as a radical, democratical, political thinker, while it is a different story with those other people. This is only for political purposes, but not only. Since the political implications of serious philosophers, as these colleagues are, no doubt, stem, of course, from philosophical premises. And I do think that, for instance, Leo Strauss, he really starts, if only in terms of a most challenging reading of classical texts. He starts from some of the Aristotelian premises, which I would in fact include in the tradition of a metaphysical thinking with which somehow this break between Hegel and the young Hegelians outdid, it means with whom they walk, with which they walk. And so most of them, I would think, are beautiful and, I must say, pedagogically, anyhow, very tempting philosophers who, examples of very tempting philosophies who, remark, which want to reestablish, to rehabilitate the substance of pre-Kantian thinking against anything what comes after. And so they are rather ultra-conservative and opt out of that whole discourse, which I only was referring to.
One more question.
I'd like to address the prefix neo as opposed to the prefix post. It seems to me quite clear that what you're saying is these people think they're beyond modernity, but they aren't. That they're really rehashing debates, the crucial substance of which was already mapped out over a century ago. And I'm wondering what's implied in that. Is it a strategy? There could be a left Hegelian interpretation of that. There could be a right Hegelian interpretation of that. In other words, there's nothing new under the sun, a kind of continuity. That would be a right Hegelian. A left Hegelian approach would be that indeed philosophers are still only interpreting the world, whereas the point is to change it. And I'm wondering what we are to presume is your presumption.
I should tell you everything about a non-written lecture, yes. I mean, about this, there's something odd about declarations of intentions, isn't it? What I'm going to do will just be follow seriously attempts to overcome metaphysics on the one hand, and attempts to continue the Nietzschean theory of power. And this is what I'm going to do. This might be not very startling, but the intention is, of course, to show that this might be blind allies, can you say that? Poisoning or something like this, in a trivial sense. Now, I do think that the strength of this Nietzschean type of argument is partly due to real weaknesses in, let's say, the tradition of Marx, or the left Hegelians, or practice philosophy, and so on and so on. I mean, you yourself have written a book on negative dialectics, and so who else should know better that Adorno provides one of the most succinct exercises in indirectly showing that a critique of instrumental reason, which can no longer rely on any concept of reason except that from the same tradition which is criticized, has to move on the level of an indirect illumination of paradoxes by which we learn something, of course. I, of course, slightly different than Adorno, take this as one, or for me personally, the most compelling indicator. For that also this tradition has, in a way, become, exhausted, not only in a negative sense, but also in that positive sense, in that if it comes to the vast sort of philosophy, it can become exhausted. It is really reflected from the inside. And that means that we, I think, I mean, not that means, but I think that there are sufficient arguments which I would like to develop for encouraging us to re-enter in this, I think, inescapable discourse on modernity from a different angle, which is not immediately implied by either of these three traditions. But in a way, the topics and the thought patterns and the games of the rules of the games are in fact analogous.